Well, thank you for joining us for another episode of Traveling Through History. Really glad you're here with us this evening. And today we're going to be talking about a very special topic. This is a part of the Revolutionary War that does not get covered very often. And that is the last 3 years of the war, which is the Southern Campaign. And typically, when you read the history books or when you watch videos about the Revolutionary War, most of the focus and attention is on the first 3 years of the war between 1775 and 1778. And most of those battles and activities took place, of course, in the North. We're talking Boston, New York, Philadelphia, New Jersey, Delaware, all the northern states were involved. Today, we're talking about one of the most important aspects of the war, which is the last 3 years of the war, 1778 through 1781, which took place mostly in the South and actually took place mostly without George Washington and his primary generals and men. And it took place with the three generals who are actually behind me right now. And that was Nathanael Greene, who was the chief architect and strategist for George Washington. He actually was with Washington at the beginning of the war up in Trenton and Princeton and some of the battles there. He also lost a couple of battles early and learned from it. So he had a lot of really good experience when he was named the chief architect of the Southern strategy. Also, you see behind me with a rifle over his shoulder is Daniel Morgan, who was one of the primary generals for Nathanael Greene, who was the theater commander. Morgan, of course, led the victory at Cowpens, which was one of the most important battles of the entire war. Similar to Trenton and Princeton, Cowpens was considered the turning point of the Southern campaign, and really the first time that the British regulars had been beaten by the Southern generals and the Southern troops. And then also you can see on my left behind me is Francis Marion. He was also a brigadier general. He was nicknamed the Swamp Fox. You'll hear a lot of people talk about the Swamp Fox as a legendary figure. Well, he really was a great general himself. He actually was never in charge of a large force. He always had very small skirmishing forces. And he was the father of our guerrilla warfare tactics that our current military, especially the special forces, use even today. And so Francis Marion, or the Swamp Fox, really became the primary brainchild of those amazing guerrilla tactics that these Continental soldiers in the South employed to try to beat the British. So we have a lot of really interesting subjects to come to you with tonight, and that is the Southern strategy, the Southern campaign, led by Nathanael Greene and his two primary generals, as you see here. We'll be talking about not just the Southern campaign, but all three of these generals in detail, about a little bit of background about them, what they did in these campaigns. We'll be watching a short video on each of them. We'll also watch a short video on the Battle of Cowpens itself, which was such an important turning point in the southern portion of the war. You have to realize at this time that the British had been very frustrated in the North. They had been battled very hard by Washington and his troops, and they started to realize that there was a real possibility that they could lose the North. And so they started thinking to themselves, well, we need to make sure we never lose the South. The South was way too important in terms of the amount of crops and types of crops that England relied on and could not grow themselves. And we'll talk some more detail about that. But essentially, they decided that if they were going to lose any part of the country, they'd rather lose the North because they could replicate everything that was produced in the North. But everything produced in the South from a crop standpoint, they could not replicate. And so the British poured all of their energy and all their resources into conquering and subduing the South from 1778 to 1781. So I really look forward to taking you through all of that. And then at the very end of the program, we will, as always, go through our 25 interesting facts about the three generals you see behind me. And hopefully you learn a lot of interesting things you didn't know about these three men from that discussion. And in all these cases, we'll come back on the other side and talk about it. So let's go ahead and give you a little bit of background information on the Southern campaign itself and then on these three generals. So the Southern Theater of the American Revolutionary War was the central theater of military operations in the second half of the American Revolutionary War from 1778 to 1781. It encompassed engagements primarily in Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, so those four southern states. Tactics considered both strategic battles and guerrilla warfare. And we mentioned that Francis Marion, or the Swamp Fox, was the guerrilla master, but also Daniel Morgan, who we'll talk about his battle at Cowpens, but also some of his other engagements. He also used very interesting and different techniques that a lot of the European generals on the British side had never seen before. And so you can imagine, if you are outnumbered, you don't have the same equipment that the other side has, you're not as trained, maybe you're using backwoods militias and people that have never been properly military trained before. You have to use every technique at your disposal, and that's what these generals were doing. Some straight military tactics and then some guerrilla tactics to win the battles. So during the first 3 years of the conflict, in 1775 to 78, the largest military encounters between the Continental Army and the British Army had been in New England and the Middle Colonies, mostly the cities of Boston, New York, Philadelphia. And after the failure at Saratoga, the British Army largely abandoned operations in the North and pursued peace through control of the southern colonies. Before 1778, these colonies were largely dominated by patriots, both governments and militias. Although there were Continental Army presence that played a role in 1776 defense of Charleston, the suppression of loyalist militias and attempts to drive British from strongly loyalist East Florida also occurred. The British began to implement their southern strategy in late 1778 in Georgia, initially achieving success with the capture of Savannah, Georgia, which was followed in 1780 by operations in South Carolina. That included the defeat of Continental forces at Charleston and Camden, which were huge defeats for the American Army. At the same time, France in 1778 and Spain in 1779 declared war on Great Britain in support of the United States. So this was a time when these two countries finally picked a side and chose the new Americas. Spain captured all of British West Florida, culminating in the single Pensacola in 1781. France initially offered only naval support for the first few years after its declaration of war, but in 1781 sent massive numbers of soldiers to join General Washington's army and marched into Virginia from New York. Major General Nathanael Greene, who took over as Continental Army commander after Camden, engaged in a strategy of avoidance and attrition against the British. The two forces fought a string of battles, mostly which were victories for the British Army. However, the cost in casualties was so high that it weakened the British. And so you can see the strategy Nathanael Greene had here, which was he knew that he was outnumbered. He knew that the British Army had better equipment. He knew they were better trained. But he used very smart strategies to engage sometimes and to retreat and march sometimes and chip away at the British Army and weaken it, because the British Army did not have the men or the ability to resupply or reinforce themselves. And Greene had that ability to always pull men out of the backcountry of these different states. This was best exemplified by the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina, and not too far from where I live, actually, in Greensboro. Several American victories, such as the Battle of Ramsar's Hill, Battle of Cowpens, which we mentioned with Daniel Morgan, and the Battle of Kings Mountain, also served to weaken the overall British military strength. The culminating engagement, the Siege of Yorktown, ended with the surrender of British Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis on October 19, 1781. It was essentially the last major battle of the Revolutionary War, and shortly thereafter, negotiations began between the United States and Great Britain, resulting in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So you can see how important this southern theater was to the Americans, and that they had to find a way to bog down the British, chip away at the British, weaken them, hold steady as much as they could, although they did lose several of the ports. They lost Savannah, they lost Charleston. For the most part, Nathanael Greene, Daniel Morgan, and Francis Marion, the three of them, held their own against the British throughout this period. Even when they lost a battle, they would get right back up on their horse and keep chipping away at the British. So really, really important strategy that the Americans were employing here against the British domination in the South. Let's talk about Nathanael Greene. Major General Nathanael Greene was an American military officer and planter who served in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. He emerged from the war with the reputation of one of George Washington's most talented and dependable officers. and is known for his successful command in the southern theater of the conflict, which is what we were just talking about. He had so much trust with Washington, Washington gave him the South. He was born into a prosperous Quaker family in Warwick, Rhode Island. Greene became active in colonial opposition to British revenue policies in the early 1770s and helped establish the Kentish Guards, which was a state militia unit in Rhode Island. After the April 1775 battles of Lexington and Concord, the legislature of Rhode Island established an army and appointed Greene to command it. Later in the year, Greene became general in the newly established Continental Army. Greene served under George Washington in the Boston campaign, the New York and New Jersey campaigns, and in the Philadelphia campaign, before he was appointed quartermaster general of the Continental Army in 1778. And that, of course, was a huge post for Nathanael Greene and showed how much trust he had built up with Washington. Washington trusted him with his left arm. In October 1780, Washington appointed Greene as the commander of the Continental Army in the Southern Theater, where he was involved in several engagements, primarily in Virginia, Georgia, and South Carolina. After taking command, Greene engaged in a successful campaign of guerrilla warfare against a numerically superior British force led by Charles Cornwallis. He gained several strategic victories at Guilford Courthouse, Hobkirk Hill, and Eutaw Springs, eroding British control over the American South. Major fighting on land came to an end following the surrender of Cornwallis at the Siege of Yorktown in October 1781, as we mentioned. Greene continued to serve in the Continental Army until late 1783. After the war, he settled down to a career as a plantation owner in Georgia, but his rice crops were mostly a failure. He died in 1786 at the Mulberry Grove Plantation in Chatham County, Georgia. So you can just see the importance Nathanael Greene had to the Continental Army, the importance that Nathanael Greene had to George Washington, to the overall war effort, and the incredible things that he was able to achieve. He did suffer several losses early in his career, but that was to be expected. The Continental Army was just forming. The men were not trained. They didn't have enough equipment. Their tactics had not caught up to the battles yet, and so he learned a lot from his first several losses as a commander. And as you can see, he became very, very effective as the war went on. So let's talk a little bit about one of his subgenerals, which was Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan was an American pioneer, soldier, and politician from Virginia, one of the most respected battlefield tacticians of the American Revolutionary War of 1775 to 1783. He later commanded troops during the suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion of 1791 to 1794. Born in New Jersey, Morgan settled in Winchester, Virginia later in life. He became an officer in the Virginia militia, recruited a company of riflemen at the start of the Revolutionary War. Early in the war, Morgan served in Benedict Arnold's expedition to Quebec, Canada, and in the Saratoga campaign. He also served in the Philadelphia campaign before resigning from the Army in 1779 and retiring. Morgan returned to the Army after the Battle of Camden and led the Continental Army to victory at the Battle of Cowpens. And we mentioned that a very important battle, and we'll watch a short video about it a little bit later. After the war, Morgan retired from the Army again and developed a large estate of 1,500 acres. He was recalled to duty in 1791 through 94 to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion and commanded a portion of the army that remained in western Pennsylvania after the rebellion. A member of the Federalist Party, Morgan twice ran for United States House of Representatives, and he won election to the House in 1796. He retired from Congress in 1799 and died in 1802. So he had really a distinguished career, both as a military officer, military general, and even after the war, quelling the Whiskey Rebellion, and then on into his public service as a House of Representatives member from Virginia. Really a pretty amazing man. And as we mentioned earlier, one of the things Daniel Morgan is most known for was his very interesting battle tactics and techniques he used. They were not like anything the British had ever seen before. He very much used guerrilla tactics. He used the woods. He used different formations. He used surprise at early dawn. He would attack in the middle of the night. He did a lot of different things that, again, the British were very surprised about. And he and Francis Marion both had that penchant for the way they did battle. A lot of the British would complain about Morgan and Marion and say that what they were doing was dishonorable, and the only honorable thing was to meet on the field and meet heads up, face to face. But I think these American generals knew that they were at tremendous disadvantage from a numbers perspective, an equipment perspective, and every other way you could be at disadvantage. And the only way they were going to win was to take the gloves off and really try some of these new tactics. So let's take a look at Francis Marion. So Francis Marion, also known as the Swamp Fox, was an American military officer, planter, and politician who served during the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War. During the American Revolution, Marion supported the Patriot cause and enlisted in the Continental Army, fighting against British forces in the southern theater of the American Revolutionary War from 1780 to 1781. Though he never commanded a field army or served as a commander in a major engagement, Marion's use of irregular warfare or guerrilla warfare against the British has led him to be considered one of the fathers of guerrilla and maneuver warfare, and his tactics form a part of modern-day military doctrine from the U.S. Army's Rangers Division. So it's pretty amazing that the U.S. Rangers are still studying Francis Marion and his guerrilla tactics and the way he did things against the British when he was usually outnumbered 3-1, but used the woods and the swamps and the mud and all kinds of different tactics to chip away at the British and weaken them. So that's a little bit about the three generals and the Southern campaign in general. Let's go ahead and take a look at the first several clips and videos, and we'll come back and talk about it on the other side.
By late 1778, the British forces in North America were finding it very difficult to force the capitulation of Patriot forces in this uprising in their North American colonies. In London, Lord George Germain decided that he was going to start a new strategy. This would be known as the Southern Strategy. The idea behind it would be to cordon off the northern colonies, places like Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania. These colonies offer items and trade that the British Empire already had open access to. But the South, places like Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, were flush with rice, indigo, cotton, slaves, commodities that the British Empire could use in its global trade empire. By 1779, the British were fully focused on trying to take out the southern colonies. The idea at a bargaining table will be to potentially give the northern colonies their own independence, but keep those southern colonies. By late 1779, the British have focused on their southern strategy. They're going to go all in. They'll send some of their best officers to the south. Henry Clinton, the overall British commander in North America, will sail for Charleston. With him will come Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis, Banastre Tarleton, and a cadre of other officers, including Patrick Ferguson. On the Patriot side, you won't hear the normal household names like George Washington, who doesn't enter the Southern theater until late 1781. But you'll hear names like Andrew Pickens, the Swamp Fox, Francis Marion, Horatio Gates, and Nathanael Greene. In late 1779, the British will have their first major victory in the South, Savannah, Georgia, the capital of the colony of Georgia at the time. Then their sights will be set on Charleston, the fourth largest harbor in the colonies. Henry Clinton will take the city in May of 1780. It'll be the largest surrender of American troops during the American Revolution and until the American Civil War. With the fall of Charleston, the onus will be placed on loyalist forces rising up to join the British Crown. This will be a key component to the Southern strategy, as the British regular forces in North America were stretched thin. Plus, the Southern climate will bring disease to these men who are unfit for campaigning in a summer in the Carolinas. As they move inland, the British find problems. Charleston is their supply base, but they have to establish many other outposts at places like Camden and 96 to help supply their armies as they move outward. As they do this, British garrisons must be left behind, and loyalists must rise up. But in South Carolina, it's a true civil war. The planter class along the coast with the Piedmont class inland do not get along. Some patriots would not go to the cause of other patriots because they were in different classes. And of course, there were old family rivalries, which would be set off by warfare. Inland, battles will not go well again for Patriot forces at places like Monk's Corner, the Waxhaws, and Camden. Over a 20-month span, 3 Patriot armies will either surrender or be destroyed by British forces. Yet, the Patriot cause will stay firm, and men will rise from the backcountry and fight at places like Kings Mountain and Cowpens, turning the tide of the American Revolution. Eventually, the British will move up into North Carolina and into Virginia, where they will be cornered at Yorktown in October of 1781. The British strategy of cordoning off the South backfires. More battles will be fought in South Carolina than in all of the other colonies combined. The Loyalist forces, who the British thought would come to crown and country, did not do so. It was a war of exhaustion, not a war of annihilation. It was the long game. Time and again, the Patriot forces would turn out, sometimes in victory, many times in defeat. But it was Nathanael Greene who summed up the Southern strategy for the Americans the best. He said, "We fight, get beat, we rise, and fight again."
A boy from a Quaker family who couldn't run because of his limp? It's not exactly the model of a military legend. But Nathanael Greene was a hero of the Continental Army, not once, but twice. Born in Rhode Island in 1742, Greene was 33 when the Revolutionary War began. Most Quakers were pacifists, but he was determined to fight. And although his limp disqualified him from active duty in the Army, he was a natural leader in the militia. From there, he gained the trust of General George Washington and became a major general in the Continental Army. By 1778, the Continental Army had proved they could match the British in battle, but their supply system was broken. Starving soldiers with no ammunition could not fight. Washington appointed Greene as his new quartermaster general. Though Greene saw himself as a leader of men in battle, rather than an administrator, he swiftly improvised systems of supply dumps and wagon relays, so the Continental Army could maintain its supply lines when campaigning. Feeding an army is an expensive business, though, and Greene spent much of his time dealing with Congress, who accused him of profiteering. But Washington still backed him to the hilt, and in October 1780, Greene was selected for a new mission, command of the Southern Campaign. Greene's first decision was a gamble to split his force. He wanted to force the British to do the same, which they did. It looked like Greene's bet was paying off when General Daniel Morgan's men beat the Redcoats at the Battle of Cowpens. It was followed by the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, a bloody encounter in which Greene's force was beaten. But it was no real victory for the British. They had lost far too many troops. Greene and his men reconquered South Carolina and kept the remaining Redcoats on the back foot, all the way to the historic Patriot victory at Yorktown. As Greene himself said, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." During the Southern Campaign, Greene had made personal guarantee of payment to suppliers to ensure his troops had decent clothes, food, and weapons. When the war ended, he sold most of his personal possessions to honor the debts. He'd been accused of profiteering by Congress, but this Quaker from Rhode Island had proved that his commitment to his new nation was absolute.
During the French and Indian War in the summer of 1755, a Virginia wagoner named Daniel Morgan became involved in an argument with a British officer. Morgan knocked the officer to the ground and was sentenced by court-martial to receive 500 lashes. Miraculously, Morgan remained conscious through the ordeal and counted along with the drummer. According to Morgan, the count came up one short, and forever after, the British owed him one lash. Like many of his fellow colonists, Morgan migrated west, first to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and then south into the Shenandoah Valley, where he settled around Winchester, Virginia. Morgan soon found work hauling freight to the eastern part of Virginia, thus earning him the nickname, the Old Wagoner. Morgan continued to serve in the French and Indian War, despite the punishment he received at the hands of the British. Morgan joined a company of Virginia Rangers and barely escaped death in the spring of 1756 during an ambush where he was shot in the face. While historians disagree over the extent of Morgan's wound, we do know that he lost several teeth and bore the scars for the remainder of his life as depicted in this painting by Charles Willson Peale. The American Revolution offered Morgan a chance at payback to the British. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, Morgan raised a company of riflemen and marched them to reinforce Americans besieging Boston. He participated in Benedict Arnold's expedition to Quebec. Following his parole and exchange, Morgan led a rifle corps at the battles of Saratoga. Morgan's riflemen contributed greatly to the American victory, which ultimately led to an alliance with France. Due to his common social stature, Morgan was unable to obtain a promotion and returned home after his resignation in the summer of 1779. When news arrived of the American disaster at the Battle of Camden, Morgan left Winchester without a command and without a commission and returned to the field, this time with the Southern Department. It was there that Morgan would experience his greatest victory on the battlefield. Leading a combined force of cavalry and infantry, Morgan engaged the feared Banastre Tarleton at the Battle of Cowpens on January 17, 1781. There, Morgan employed a tactic known as a defense in depth, utilizing 3 separate lines to steadily wear down the British advance before launching a devastating counterattack. Morgan routed Tarleton off the field and later wrote that he gave Tarleton a devil of a whipping. For his victory, Congress awarded Morgan a gold medal. After the war, Morgan returned to Winchester. He took up farming, at one point owning over 250,000 acres of land, returned to service during the Whiskey Rebellion, and served a term in the House of Representatives. He died on July 6, 1802, and is buried in the Mount Hebron Cemetery in Winchester. Former comrade in arms Light Horse Harry Lee wrote of Morgan, "No man lived who better loved this world, and no man more reluctantly quit it." Unable to destroy General George Washington's Continental Army in the early stages of the American Revolution, the British High Command decided to shift its strategy and focus on the southern colonies late in 1779. The Crown forces enjoyed initial success with twin victories at Charleston and Camden. But in the fall, the tide began to turn, with a Patriot victory at the Battle of Kings Mountain in October, and again in January 1781 at the Battle of Cowpens. In December 1780, Brigadier General Daniel Morgan was appointed to command a flying army which consisted of state troops, Continental regulars, and dragoons. His mission was to move into the backcountry of South Carolina and harass the British outpost. Determined to defeat Morgan, the British commander, Lord Charles Cornwallis, chose one of his top subordinates for the task, Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton. Tarleton had established a fearsome reputation for his aggressive tactics on the battlefield. Tarleton caught up with Morgan below the Broad River in South Carolina on the morning of January 17, 1781. This open rolling meadow was used by locals to herd their cattle before driving them to market and was known as the Cowpens. The terrain was perfectly suited to Morgan's battle plan. He decided to form his men into 3 lines. The first consisted of riflemen from Georgia and South Carolina. Behind that, he formed his militia. The idea, later known as a defense in depth, was to exhaust the British advance and inflict as many casualties as possible before the British reached the 3rd and final line, consisting of Continental regulars. There, Morgan hoped to deal a decisive blow to Tarleton. The fighting began before first light on January 17, 1781, when Morgan's riflemen encountered the British vanguard. Tarleton quickly shook out a battle line, with his infantry in the center and his cavalry guarding each flank. The riflemen slowed Tarleton's advance before withdrawing back to the militia line. There, the militia fired 2 volleys and then withdrew to Morgan's 3rd line. Tarleton was advancing into Morgan's trap. When Tarleton's advance reached the 3rd line, it was quickly brought to a halt by the Continental regulars. Tarleton decided to bring up his reserves in an attempt to flank the American position. To meet this maneuver, the Continentals faced about and withdrew calmly as if they were on the parade ground. Morgan, watching from the rear in horror, thought that his line had broken and rode up and down the line, exhorting his men to face about, boys, give them one good volley and the victory is ours. The Continentals wheeled about and delivered a withering volley into the British ranks. Morgan ordered a bayonet charge, with his infantry bearing down on Tarleton's front and the militia and cavalry swinging around on the flanks. Known as a double envelopment, Morgan's counterattack swallowed up Tarleton's force, and the British retreated in a rout from the field. "I gave him a devil of a whipping," Morgan wrote several days later. Indeed, Morgan's victory helped boost American morale, inflicted casualties that Cornwallis could not replace, and set off a string of events that would end 9 months later with the British surrender at Yorktown.
Many British aristocrats loved fox hunting, but in the 1780s in South Carolina, there was one they just couldn't catch. Known as the swamp fox, he was a skilled guerrilla leader. His real name was Francis Marion. Soon after the Revolutionary War broke out, Marion, already an experienced military officer, became a Continental Army colonel. His role as a guerrilla fighter began with an appropriately fox-like act. He was at a party in Charleston and wanted to leave, so he jumped out of a window. The fall broke his ankle, and Marion left Charleston to recuperate. So when the British took the city and thousands of Patriot prisoners, he wasn't there. Marion, his ankle still broken, responded quickly. He put together a small force of partisans in the Black and PD Rivers area. His band would strike at a target, cunningly disappear, race ahead, then shoot anyone pursuing them. Marion soon gained his Swamp Fox nickname. He also rescued prisoners of war. As Marion was made Brigadier General of the South Carolina State Militia, his makeshift army grew, and so did his legend. That got the attention of the British General of the Southern Campaign, Lord Cornwallis. He needed Loyalist sympathizers to join up and fight, but the tales of the Swamp Fox making fools of the British was bad advertisement. Cornwallis sent forces to hunt down the fox, including the notoriously brutal British officer Bannister Tarleton. Local Loyalist leaders who hated Marion were definitely trying to track him down, but nobody ever succeeded. Marion just wasn't the type for showdowns, refusing to ambush the British retreat from Charleston in 1782. He knew that when the war ended, those fighting each other would have to learn to live side by side again. The cunning fox saw no reason to use more force than was strictly necessary.
So we have a lot to talk about out of that string of videos. The first one, just talking generally about the Southern campaign itself, you can see it was very important to the British that they captured the South. As we talked about earlier, it was strategic for them. It also was their pipeline back home to all the crops that they needed, and they just couldn't afford to give up those southern states. And so they decided to essentially go all in on the South the last 3 years of the war. And you can see that George Washington had built up a lot of trust with Nathanael Greene. They had actually become best friends, not just colleagues, but actually would hang around and have a glass of whiskey or wine at night, play cards, and talk about military strategy. And he had a lot of trust with Greene. And so he, after his success up in Trenton and Princeton and some of the northern campaigns up there, and after he named him quartermaster, where he had him help solve the supply line issue for the Continental Army, which had been really bad. And Greene had really solved that issue and had worked with Congress to do so. He was then given the command of the Southern Theater, which was a huge honor and a huge challenge, as you can see. The Continental Army was very outnumbered, outsupplied, outtrained. Were in some cases using Continental regulars, in other cases using backwoodsmen that had never been in an engagement before. And so Greene really had a challenge on his hands. Fortunately, he was able to find some of these great generals and colonels, including Dan Morgan and Francis Marion, two of the ones that he relied on very much, as you could see. And you can see he was accused by Congress of profiteering from the war, which couldn't have been further from the truth. Actually, Greene, throughout the war, put up his own credit and in some cases his own assets for his own men to feed them, to equip them. So it was just the opposite of what Congress is accusing him of. And in his retirement, ended up having to sell 2 of his 3 homes that he had inherited to pay off his debts that he had racked up during the war to pay for his men's food and shelter. So pretty amazing man. And he had always been interested in military theory ever since he was a young man. And we'll talk some more about that in detail later. But it really came to really good use when it came to both his northern campaign and his southern command. For the Continental Army, it was just huge that he was such a great strategist. So that was Nathanael Greene. Then you saw with Daniel Morgan, he had a pretty amazing background as well. As you heard, he took 500 lashes or 499 lashes. He said there were one short. When I read about this punishment that he was given for being insubordinate to a British officer during the French and Indian War, it said that if you take 500 lashes, about half of the people who take those actually die of those lashes. So it's actually pretty incredible that he actually survived that punishment and counted along with the drummer during the lashes. He survived that. He survived getting shot in the face, which broke his jaw and knocked a bunch of his teeth out. And he had that big scar on his face for the rest of his life. He also, at one point, got shot in the leg and it broke his femur. So Morgan was a really, really tough guy. And the only reason he ended up resigning in 1779 was he saw a number of other generals who had been passed over. He saw a number of other generals who had passed over him and gotten promotion, and he had not. And his belief at that time was that he had been passed over because he wasn't part of the upper class of the country. So he resigned. But when he saw the tremendous victory by the British at Camden several years later, he decided to re-enter the fray. And thank goodness he did, because Greene really needed him, and assigned him to a force of cavalry, infantry, and backwoodsmen. And as you saw, he had the most glorious victory of the Southern campaign itself, which was at Cowpens. He employed that incredible strategy where he formed several lines, and he would have each line shoot a volley at the British and then retreat. And then the next line would step up, and the British would keep coming. That next line would volley, and then they would retreat. So he was using every tactic that the British had never seen before. By the time the British had gotten all the way up to his third line, he had his cavalry surround both flanks, and they completely enveloped Tarleton's force and essentially slaughtered them with over 550 casualties and 800 men taken prisoner. So huge victory for the Continental Army, and they really needed it. They had been kind of on a losing streak in the Southern campaign. So that was Morgan. And then finally you saw the Swamp Fox, Francis Marion at the end there, also a brigadier general, fierce fighter. And as you had seen, he was the father of guerrilla warfare in American history. Morgan was too, but Francis Marion especially had mastered the art of taking his men, a very small force, through the woods, through swamps, through muddy areas, and chipping away at the British, killing a couple at a time and then retreating, killing a couple at a time and retreating. And he had actually observed this strategy by watching the Cherokee Indians in the French and Indian Wars. He had observed how stealthy they were and how cunning they were in using guerrilla warfare in the woods. And so Francis Marion used a lot of those techniques in these battles against the British. And he just absolutely drove the British crazy. Cornwallis and Tarleton and all the British generals spent months trying to find him, and they could never find him. And that's why they call him the Swamp Fox. So that's a little bit about the Southern theater and those three amazing generals that essentially were the saviors of the South for the Continental Army and for America. Let's go ahead and take a look at the 25 interesting facts about these three generals. The British Southern strategy was to hold the Southern states even if they lost the North. The Southern strategy was a plan implemented by the British during the Revolutionary War to win the conflict by concentrating their forces in the southern states of Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. The southern states produced many crops that England needed, such as indigo and cotton and rice and tobacco and wheat, all of which did not grow well in England. The British saw the Continental Army's success in the North as a threat to their need for Southern economy's products, and therefore determined to occupy Richmond, Virginia, Wilmington, North Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia, which is essentially all the ports other than Richmond, but the other three were all the big ports back then in continental America. The goal was to hold the ports and the southern states so that if England had to withdraw from the North, they would still have control of the South and its economy and its crops to be sent back to England. Washington and Nathanael Greene determined that the South needed to be saved from the British and set out a campaign and a strategy to do it with the assistance of Morgan and Marion. You see really three excellent books there to read. I highly recommend all of them. The first one up there is Nathanael Greene, which is Washington's general. Then the second one there is a book about Daniel Morgan, and you see him there with his riflemen. And then the third one is Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. So these are all really, really great books if you want to pick them up and read more about these three men. So number one, General Nathanael Greene was a brilliant military strategist. Nathanael Greene was an officer in the Continental Army who led American forces to a strategic victory in the Southern Campaign. He was a friend of George Washington and is considered by many to be a brilliant military strategist, perhaps only second to Washington himself. When the war started, Rhode Island raised 3 regiments, which included Greene and his militia, and sent them to join in the siege of Boston. When Congress organized the Continental Army, Greene was commissioned as the Brigadier General. After the British evacuated Boston, Washington went to New York and left Greene in command. So that was his first time actually being left in command. And you can see he had been building up his trust with Washington all along and had shown on the battlefield his chops. Number 2, General Daniel Morgan started as a teamster. Daniel Morgan, an American hero during the American Revolution in the Southern Campaign, grew up with a rebellious streak. As a young man, he settled in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley outside. As a young man, he settled in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley outside of Winchester. Morgan worked as a teamster, hauling freight to the eastern part of the colony. His teamster career drew him into the French and Indian War, during which he helped to supply the British Army. He soon became known as the Old Wagoner. He accompanied General Edward Braddock on his ill-fated campaign against the French and Indians at Fort Duquesne. Morgan observed the guerrilla tactics used by the French and Indians in the war against the British, using the woods to come in and out of the light skirmishes and chip away at the British, and he made a mental note of it and would use these techniques later himself against the British. So pretty interesting. He started as a teamster and he learned those battle techniques by observing what the Indians and French were doing. Number 3, General Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, joined a schooner crew. You can see a picture there of the schooner that would have been representative of at that time, and a picture of Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox himself. Through his life, though his life started as a small farm boy with malformed legs, Francis Marion grew up to fight in the French and Indian War, battle for liberty during the American Revolution, and have a career in politics. At the age of 15, the restless farm boy joined a crew of a schooner bound for the West Indies. During his first voyage, the ship sunk, supposedly ran by a whale. 5 of the 7-men crew luckily survived and escaped in a lifeboat, including Marion. Drifting for a week until making it to land, Francis declared that was enough sailing for him, and he decided to stay ashore, where he started managing his family's plantation in South Carolina. So what an adventure that was for a 15-year-old boy. He barely survived, went on his first boat journey and almost died of starvation and drowning. So pretty amazing. Number 4, General Greene lost his first 2 battles. The young General Greene's career was not without blemish. During the New York campaign, he lost Forts Washington and Lee. Although racked by guilt for these losses, Greene subsequently led a column of troops to victory at the Battle of Trenton and at the Battle of Princeton. And if you haven't checked out our episode on Trenton and Princeton that we did a couple weeks ago, definitely check it out. Had a lot of really good stuff in there about those 2 battles. So following the Battle of Brandywine and the Battle of Germantown in the Pennsylvania campaign in 1777, the Continental Congress appointed him Quartermaster General under the condition that he retained the right to command troops in the field. And you saw that in the video that he was named to that position, although it was largely an administrative position, but they knew he had the administrative skills to make this work. And the supply lines had gotten so bad during the war, the men were starving to death and had no shoes and no equipment. So he had to do that as best he could. He performed his duties as quartermaster brilliantly, skillfully supplying Continental troops while dealing with logistical and bureaucratic challenges. Greene's most notable appointment came in October 1780, when the Continental Congress granted Washington with the power to appoint a new Southern commander. Washington selected Greene. Up to that point, Congress struggled to select the right commanders in the South. Robert Howe had lost Savannah, Benjamin Lincoln had lost Charleston, and Horatio Gates had lost Camden, South Carolina. So you can see all 3 of these generals had not done very well in the South, and they really needed someone to start racking up victories, and that's why they chose Greene. Number 5, General Morgan almost died twice in the French and Indian War. And we mentioned this a little bit earlier. During the French and Indian conflict, Morgan annoyed a British superior officer who struck him with a flat side of his sword. Morgan knocked the man down. For his impertinence, Morgan was punished with 500 lashes, typically fatal number at that time. He survived the ordeal, carrying his scars and his disdain for the British for the rest of his life. You can imagine what he felt about the British after 500 lashes. Afterward, when Morgan retold the story, he commonly boasted that the British had miscounted, only giving him 499 lashes. Morgan eventually joined a company of rangers in the Shenandoah Valley. Outside Fort Edward, Morgan and his companion were ambushed by Indians allied with the French. Morgan took a musket ball through the back of his neck that crushed his left jaw and exited his cheek, taking all his teeth out on that side of his mouth. He miraculously survived the encounter, but carried the scars with him for the rest of his life. So this really was a tough guy. I mean, multiple times he could have and probably should have died at the hands of the British and at the hands of the French and the Indians in these different skirmishes. Number 6, General Francis Marion barely avoided capture by the British. So after the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775, the Provincial Congress of South Carolina voted to raise 3 regiments and commissioned Francis to be the captain of 1 regiment. His first assignment was at Fort Sullivan in Charleston Harbor, where he fought valiantly in June 1776. His unit moved to Savannah in 79, and after the failed American attempt to retake the city, he returned to Charleston. Francis escaped a devastating surrender at Charleston because he had a broken foot and had previously traveled to the countryside to heal 2 days earlier. And you saw in the video what an amazing occurrence that was. He had wanted to leave a party and essentially jumped from the second floor down to the ground floor and broke his foot. And because he broke his foot, was ordered to go take rest in the countryside and come back once he was healed up. And because he was in the countryside, he was not there when the Continental Army had to surrender 5,000 troops to the British at Charleston. So really a good twist of fate there. Number 7, General Greene's brilliant strategy to divide his troops was decisive. Greene decided to divide his troops in the hopes that the British would be forced to follow suit and would draw them away from Charleston and the support there. The tactic worked, as Greene's subordinate, Brigadier General Daniel Morgan, won a victory at Cowpens early in 1781. After the British fought the Americans at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, the much depleted British force under Charles Cornwallis withdrew to Wilmington, while Greene and his men turned south to reconquer the South Carolina backcountry, and they did so. Throughout 1781, Greene steadily drove the British back to an isolated position at Charleston, which they abandoned the following December. George Washington trusted Greene immensely, and that trust only grew over the course of the war. Greene's legacy endures, and he's one of the most celebrated generals of the Revolution for his crucial role in wresting the Southern theater from the British and securing a revolutionary patriot victory. See a picture there of Greene and a picture of his plaque at one of his key locations where he led a battle to victory. Number 8, Daniel Morgan's men were expert riflemen. You see a picture there of Morgan leading his men with their long rifles. After the outbreak of the American Revolution, Morgan led the force of riflemen to reinforce the Patriots laying siege to Boston in 1775. This company was known as Morgan's Riflemen, marched from Virginia to Boston in 21 days. These Southerners and frontiersmen quickly gained a reputation for their hard-fighting ways and their incredible accuracy with their long rifles. They also distinguished themselves through their dress. Morgan and his men wore hunting shirts, a distinctly American garment that soon struck fear in the British Army because of the known accuracy of the American riflemen, and soon became a common uniform item in the Continental Army. So it wasn't just Morgan's riflemen that were starting to wear these hunting shirts, but other units started wearing them as well. Later in 1775, Morgan participated in the American expedition to invade Canada, organized by General Benedict Arnold. During the Battle of Quebec, Arnold suffered a wound to his leg, forcing command of the American forces on Morgan. The combat, however, resulted in his capture along with 400 other Americans. So you can imagine this. Morgan was actually captured alongside 400 others at this battle. His release several months later was followed by his promotion to colonel in the 11th Virginia Regiment. So Morgan was really on the rise. Not only had he gone to support in 1775 up north in Boston, but he had followed Benedict Arnold into Quebec, and he had kind of proved his valor in that battle as well. Number 9, Francis Marion was named the Swamp Fox by British Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton. After the fall of Charleston, Francis took command of a militia unit and had quick success, leading 50 militiamen on a guerrilla-style raid on the British in the Carolina backcountry. The unit hid in dense forest. You can see a picture there on the bottom right of the kind of forests and swamps and mud that they would operate in. And they would go and chip away and kill a couple British, and then they would disappear back into the woods again. The unit hid in dense forest just as the Cherokee Indians had, surprising the British encampment and rescuing 150 American prisoners. Though his force was almost always smaller than his opponents, Francis used this to his advantage, making the British split their forces to search for him and always moving quicker than his opponents. He made South Carolina inhospitable for the British. Even British Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, known for his speed and ruthlessness, could not find Francis. In fact, Tarleton gave Francis Marion the nickname that remains to this day. In November 1780, Tarleton learned about Marion's position and moved with his cavalry to intercept. However, Francis evaded the British cavalrymen for 26 miles, eventually escaping into the Carolina swamp. Tarleton gave up the pursuit, saying, "As for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him." This story traveled around the South, and Francis Marion earned the name the Swamp Fox. So pretty amazing that his enemy, the British general, the British Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton, actually gave him the nickname. Number 10, General Nathanael Greene was involved in inquiries into Benedict Arnold and British Major John Andre for spying. In 1780, Greene learned that Benedict Arnold was working with the British, and he served as the head of the Board of Inquiry that tried and convicted Major John Andre for spying. Major Andre was then hung for treason by the Continental Army. Greene eventually resigned as quartermaster and replaced Arnold as commander at West Point. Not long after, the American forces in the South, under the command of Horatio Gates, suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Camden. Washington sent Greene to replace Gates as the commander of the Southern Theater of the War. See a picture there on the bottom left, that's Benedict Arnold. And then in the center, that's John Andre being accosted by several men who found some plans in his boot and realized that he was a spy. And then, of course, the hanging of John Andre after he was tried and convicted of spying. Number 11, Daniel Morgan used new ideas and tactics in the fight against the British Army. One of Morgan's most valuable qualities as a commander was his ability to think beyond the confines of the accepted standards of warfare and to employ guerrilla tactics. Not long after becoming colonel, he was placed in charge of a corps of light infantry made up of Virginians, Pennsylvanians, Marylanders, and he began to employ tactics designed to disturb the disciplined royal troops. He and his men wore Indian disguises and used hit-and-run maneuvers against the British in New York and New Jersey throughout 1777. Later in 1777, Morgan was assigned to General Horatio Gates' army and participated in the pivotal battle at Saratoga. During one of the engagements near Saratoga, one of Morgan's riflemen killed British General Simon Fraser and helped turn the tide of that battle. And of course, Saratoga was a big victory for the Continental Army. So you can see Morgan also, like Greene, had a lot of really good experience from different battles that had occurred up north, and he brought that to the South. Number 12, Marion, the Swamp Fox, inspired the movie The Patriot. Marion's exploits even inspired the 2000 film The Patriot, where Mel Gibson played a glorified figure of Francis Marion. His character, Benjamin Martin, is a Southern farmer thrust into the American Revolution after the British killed his son. The movie is fictional, but much of the story gains its background from the Swamp Fox, Francis Marion. Following the American Revolution, Francis Marion returned to his farm at age 54 and married a 49-year-old cousin, Mary Esther Vidu. Staying in the public and military limelight, he commanded a peacetime militia and served in the South Carolina Assembly. In the assembly, Marion opposed punishing those Americans who remained loyal to the British during the war. In 1790, he assisted with writing the South Carolina State Constitution, and then he retired from public life. It's very interesting that he opposed the loyalists who had stayed loyal to the crown being punished. He really wanted the country to come back together, and he wanted everyone to be able to get along. And so that was really big of him to do. Pretty interesting that he was the inspiration for this character by Mel Gibson in the movie The Patriot. It's a really good movie. Recommend you check it out if you like to see continental battle scenes. There's some really great battle scenes in this movie, especially some of the big scenes in the fields and in the woods that show kind of some of the guerrilla tactics that he used. Number 13, General Greene in his early years ran his father's business and was head of the Rhode Island militia. He moved to Coventry, Rhode Island in 1770 to take charge of a forge built by his father and his uncles, which he ran for several years. After managing a branch of his father's iron foundry, Greene served several terms in the colonial legislature and continued to study military strategy and art of war from world history. Greene sympathized strongly with the Whig ideas among the colonists, and in 1774 joined the local militia. In December 1774, he was on a committee appointed by the Assembly to revise the military laws. In December 1774, he was on a committee appointed by the Assembly to revise the militia laws. His zeal in attending to military duty led to his expulsion from the Society of Friends, which is a peace society. Not only was Greene deeply interested in the military, he also favored independence, as evidenced by letters to Samuel Ward in October 1775 and 76, who was a delegate from Rhode Island to the Continental Congress. He was elected commander of the Rhode Island Army, organized in 1775. Number 14, Daniel Morgan's first promotion was after a direct recommendation by George Washington. In the fall 1776, Washington wrote to recommend to particular notice of Congress Captain Daniel Morgan, a good and valuable officer, and suggested he was the fit and proper person to succeed Colonel Hugh Stevenson as commander of a rifle unit. Taking Washington's advice, Congress promoted Morgan to the rank of colonel in the Continental Army and placed him in charge of Stevenson's independent light infantry unit after Morgan was released by the British in early 1777. In August, Washington sent Morgan and his corps to northern New York under the authority of General Horatio Gates. Morgan and his riflemen were instrumental in the surrender of British General John Burgoyne at Saratoga. Gates considered Morgan's unit the corps the army of General Burgoyne were the most afraid of, and told Congress that too much praise cannot be given to the corps commanded by Colonel Morgan. So you can see, not only was he a badass and a great rifleman, but his men were very, very tough, and they were always successful. One of his men actually said later in the Southern campaign that old Morgan has never lost a battle, and that really was true. Number 15, Francis Marion was born the same year as George Washington. The youngest of 7 children, Francis Marion was born to French immigrant Gabriel Marion and Esther Cordes in 1732, the same year as George Washington. Raised on his family's rice plantation in St. John's Parish of Berkeley County, South Carolina, Marion would grow up some 500 miles from Washington in Westmoreland County, Virginia. Both Marion and Washington would rise through the ranks during the American Revolution, with Marion being promoted to Brigadier General of the South Carolina militia, and Washington to Commander-in-Chief of the entire Continental Army. After the war, Marion would serve multiple terms in the South Carolina Senate, while Washington became the first elected president of the United States in 1789. So both these men really rose quite quickly, and you can see they had similar paths to excellence. Number 16, Generals Greene, Morgan, and Marion all had physical problems to overcome. So you see Greene on the top left, in the middle is Morgan, and on the bottom left is Francis Marion. Greene was born with a limp that he had to overcome to lead his men and rise in the ranks in the Continental Army. He proved to be the lead strategist for George Washington and would ride behind his lines on his majestic horse. Morgan had a bad back because of the 500 lashes he took at the hands of the British in the French and Indian War, and he was shot one of his legs, which broke his femur, and of course he was shot in the face, as you saw. He had a limp the rest of his life and, of course, a bad back. Marion was born with deformed legs, which he overcame over his life with constant exercise in the backcountry in South Carolina. He also had a persistent limp. It's really all three of these men were leading their men, but all had a persistent limp that they had to overcome. Number 17, Greene studied the great military strategists in world history. Greene's southern campaign showed remarkable strategic features that remind one of Vicomte de Turenne, who was a 17th century French commander whom he had taken as his model in his studies before the war. And you see a picture there of the Vicomte, who was one of the greatest military commanders for France. He excelled in dividing and eluding and tiring his opponent by long marches, and in actual conflict, forcing them to pay for a temporary advantage at a price they could not afford. He was greatly assisted by his able subordinates, including Tadeusz Kościuszko, a Polish engineer, cavalry captains Henry Light Horse Harry Lee and William Washington, and militia leaders like Daniel Morgan, Thomas Sumter, and Francis Marion. So really, Greene had quite a crew here of folks in the Southern Theater that all were fantastic leaders and had really great crews, even though they were outnumbered, used all kinds of tactics to make sure they were successful. Number 18, Morgan crafted the perfect battle plan at Cowpens, South Carolina. You saw that in the video, a little bit of some of the 3 lines that he created. But by mid-November 1780, Morgan was finally made a brigadier general by Congress. In early 1781, Morgan learned that Cornwallis and Colonel Tarleton were moving to attack his corps. Early in the morning on January 17, 1781, Tarleton led an attack on Morgan's forces at Cowpens, South Carolina. Morgan's battle plan combined militia, regulars, and cavalry. He placed a small line of skirmishers out in front who were to fall back into main militia line under Colonel Andrew Pickens' command. Behind the militia line, Morgan placed the Continental regulars. Behind these 3 lines, Morgan stationed Lieutenant Colonel William Washington's cavalry. Once the battle began, Pickens' militia and skirmishers, after firing at the British, escaped off the battlefield and, under Morgan's encouragement, reformed behind the main line of regulars. Once Tarleton's troops broke their line to charge the Americans, Washington's cavalry moved around the British right flank while Pickens led reformed militia around the British left flank, completing the double envelope movement. Although Tarleton retreated, the British casualties amounted to 110 killed, 702 captured. The Battle of Cowpens was Morgan's most successful battle. And so you can see the tactics and the strategy used that day were really pretty incredible, what they were able to achieve with lesser numbers, but purely through tactics and through strategy on the battlefield. Number 19, Francis Marion never commanded a large army, and we mentioned this a little bit in his video. Throughout his 25-year military career, Francis Marion never led a large military force or experienced victory in a major battle, despite rising the ranks from lieutenant to brigadier general of the Continental Army's 2nd South Carolina Regiment. However, Marion's role was just as important in achieving American independence, relying on his cunning, resourcefulness, and determination to outsmart, outmaneuver, and defeat the British and Loyalists using guerrilla tactics in small skirmishes across the South. Marion fought in notable engagements throughout the Revolution, including the Battle of Sullivan's Island in Charleston Harbor, the first Patriot victory over British Royal Navy of the Revolutionary War. He also fought in the sieges of Savannah, of Fort Watson, Fort Mott, and the Battle of Eutaw Springs, among dozens of others. His most important role was to be the constant irritant of the British in the Southern Theater, to slow their movements and allow Greene and Morgan to defeat the British to key positions for American victories. So he really was kind of that irritant. He was out there chipping away at the British at all times, slowing them down, reducing their forces, reducing their defenses, making them waste ammunition. He was really cunning and resourceful and used this guerrilla warfare very effectively. Number 20, Greene was offered major posts after the war. Following the war, South Carolina and Georgia voted Greene liberal grants of lands and money. He sold the South Carolina estate, which was Boone's barony, to meet bills for the rations of his Southern Army, which he paid with his own credit. And I mentioned that earlier. He had been accused by Congress of profiteering, but it was actually just the opposite. He had racked up debt during the war on his own behalf and on behalf of his own troops to feed them and supply them. After twice refusing the post of Secretary of War in 1781 and 84, under the Articles of Confederation, he settled with his wife Katie and children in 1785 on the Georgia estate Mulberry Grove, which is north of Savannah. There he died of sunstroke on June 19, 1786, which was really a freak thing. They had really lined him up for a future in potentially politics or other big posts, but he died at a relatively young age. Like other prominent generals on the American side, Greene was a self-trained soldier. His strategy of exhausting the enemy in the South shortened a war that the Americans could never have won directly. His famous words, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again," became the rallying cry for the men of the Southern campaign. You see a picture there of the quote there in the middle. And then on the left there is the actual plantation where he settled in Georgia, called Mulberry Grove. Number 21, Morgan had to retire because of ill health after the Battle of Cowpens. Since the invasion of Quebec, Morgan had suffered from chronic sciatica, which is back pain, which had become more painful the more times he spent on the horse. His health made it difficult to continue in the service of the country after his efforts in the Southern campaign. He was forced to return home, but his efforts at Cowpens meant that General Washington would oppose a greatly weakened Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown in October 1781. So really what Morgan had done and what Greene had done, what Marion had done, all of these great generals and leaders had weakened the British so much in the Southern campaign that when Washington finally got to Yorktown, he had a very weakened Cornwallis to fight. After the war, Morgan played a role in putting down the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania. In 1797, he was elected to represent Virginia in the U.S. House of Representatives. He retired from Congress in 1799 when his declining health made it impossible for him to run for re-election. Daniel Morgan died at his home in Winchester, Virginia in July of 1802 at the age of 67. And you see a picture there on the bottom left of him holding what would have been a long rifle similar to Morgan's rifleman, and a statue of him there in Winchester, Virginia. Number 22, Francis Marion learned his swamp fox guerrilla tactics from Cherokee Indians. We mentioned this a little bit earlier. Francis, at age 25, joined the South Carolina militia, where he fought in a brutal campaign against the Cherokee Indians during the French and Indian War. Finding success in the militia and rising from the ranks, Francis also learned a great deal from the Native Americans he fought. The Cherokee used the landscape to their advantage, rather than fighting in the European style of lines. They concealed themselves in the Carolina backwoods to mount successful ambushes on Francis and his fellow militiamen. 2 decades later, he employed similar tactics against British troops. So you can see he really paid attention to what the Indians were doing. And so did Daniel Morgan. Both of them learned a lot of their guerrilla tactics and ideas from fighting the Indians in the French and Indian War. See a picture there of Francis Marion on the top talking to some of his generals. And then on the bottom there, that's a boat of some of the men that Francis Marion and his men were able to get out of captivity in the Charleston area. So they actually freed 150 men and took them on these boats. 23, Nathanael Greene was best friends with Thomas Paine and George Washington. You see a picture there in the middle of Thomas Paine, and on the very right is Nathanael Greene. And then you'll see there's a 1-cent postage stamp there on the bottom left of George Washington and Nathanael Greene on the same stamp. Enlightened political philosopher Thomas Paine and the pragmatic, reserved, and ardent military strategist General Nathanael Greene had a very close relationship. Their backgrounds were not only miles apart in distance, but upbringing as well. Paine grew up in a thatch-roofed house in the section of Norfolk, England, known as the Wilderness, while Greene was raised in the fine colonial manor built from the well-rooted Rhode Island family shipping business. They wrote regular letters to each other throughout the war to discuss matters of independence. Greene was also very close friends with George Washington, who he reported to throughout the war, and he had become Washington's most trusted general of the war. So pretty interesting that his two best friends were Thomas Paine and George Washington. Number 24, Morgan's rifle group was a precursor to today's special forces. You can see a picture there of what the long rifle looked like. It was really long and much more accurate than the muskets had been before. Morgan's riflemen were a group of sharp-shooting Americans who became one of the United States' earliest elite units. Today's Army Rangers take many of Morgan's elite unit tactics into their training and battle plans, including many of the guerrilla-type tactics Morgan and his small unit employed. They served as light infantry force and distinguished themselves time and time again in every battle. The quote was, "Old Morgan has never lost a battle or a skirmish." They wore hunting shirts, a garment that allowed them to stand out and would soon cause them to be feared. Once they provided an exhibition of their shooting skills with the Virginia Gazette reporting that a man held between his knees a board 5 inches wide and 7 inches long with a paper bullseye the size of $1. A rifleman at 60 yards without a rest put 8 bullets in succession through the bullseye. The unit didn't carry muskets, but the famed Kentucky rifles, also known as Pennsylvania rifle or long rifle. They were built primarily by German immigrants. The rifles are much more accurate than muskets because of the rifling in their bores that spins and better stabilizes the projectile. The rifles had long barrels and fired a relatively small caliber for the time. Their effective range was up to 250 yards, which was more than double that of the musket. So you can see these were much more deadly, much more accurate, almost like the sniper rifle would be in today's military. So this was the precursor, the sniper of the Special Forces unit or elite unit. Number 25, Francis Swamp Fox Marion is the father of the U.S. Army Rangers. So not only do the Rangers use a lot of Daniel Morgan's techniques, but they also consider Francis Swamp Fox Marion as the father of their unit. Marion is considered to be the father of the modern guerrilla warfare and maneuver warfare. He's also considered to be the father of the United States Army Rangers. Unlike the Continental troops, Marion's men, as they were known, served without pay and supplied their own horses, arms, and their own food. Marion rarely committed his men to frontal warfare, but repeatedly surprised larger bodies of loyalists or British regulars with quick surprise attacks and equally quick withdrawal from the field. Once Marion had shown his ability at guerrilla warfare, making himself a serious nuisance to the British, Governor John Rutledge commissioned him a brigadier general of state troops. So pretty incredible, the number of different techniques that Marion came up with and Morgan came up with, and the impact that they've had on our military and different tactics ever since. So hopefully you enjoyed that, learning more about the Southern campaign of the American Revolution. You learned about these three fabulous leaders in our history, the effectiveness that they had. You had, of course, Nathanael Greene, Daniel Morgan, and Francis Marion all had a humongous impact in that campaign. It really was kind of the last stand for the British on American soil, what these men were able to achieve with the men underneath them and the battles they were able to win, or if they didn't win, still come back from and stand up against the British for. Forced Yorktown in 1781 and then eventually forced a peace in 1783 and allowed the Americans to realize their full independence. So it can't be stated enough how important these three generals were. And I hope you do take a look at all three of them, dig into their histories a little bit more, read some of the books about these men and the things that they were able to achieve in really just a short couple of years in the war. They were able to distinguish themselves. They were able to distinguish themselves. So please like this video and subscribe to the channel, and hopefully please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And we have a lot of great material coming your way. And thank you very much. And we hope you love history the way we do. Have a great evening.